So in the course of these lectures, the main concept that I've tried to develop and explore is one about what the Roman state actually was. From the earliest point, even back into the Roman monarchy, we can understand the Roman state as consisting of effectively a polity that is made up of citizens. Citizens who play a role in participating in the decisions that polity makes, and also citizens who have certain expectations of the obligations they have to the success of the Roman polity and the sorts of rights and protections that polity is supposed to extend to them. We saw under the monarchy this process of Roman citizens dividing the responsibility for choosing who the Roman king would be. So patricians would find the king, non-patricians would vote to approve the king. Under the Republic, we saw an evolving constitutional structure in which patricians and plebeians increasingly shared power over the Roman state, but they still ensured a basic set of principles. The principle that Roman citizen lives were to be held protected pending a trial and pending an appeal. So Roman lives could not be taken just randomly by people in charge of the state. Instead, there was supposed to be a judicial process for protecting this. The same was true of Roman property. Roman property was not supposed to be taken just randomly. There were legal processes for these things to be done. And also, there was a very real sense that Roman citizens participated to a degree in the decision-making in that state. Now, just as under the monarchy, that decision-making was not something that Roman citizens participated in with an equal amount of weight attached to their voices. Some Roman votes mattered more than other Roman votes. More important, more wealthy, or more well-positioned Romans had more of a say in how the decisions of the state were made than regular, non-elite Romans. But participation still mattered. Even if you lived in or belonged to a voting tribe, and it was a tribe, one of the urban tribes where lots of people would turn out for the election, your vote probably mattered very little, but it still mattered that you voted because you had a role in that state. Now, the discussion of the Roman Republic starts from that principle, and it shows that as the Roman Republic develops, the citizenship body, or the citizen body, expands as citizenship is extended to more people across Italy. The idea of participation, even if it is a kind of abstract participation where citizens in, say, Capua or Campania or Bruttium never actually come to Rome to vote at all, even though they never actually physically take part in the voting, they are part of that participatory entity that is the Roman citizen body that bestows legitimacy on the decisions made in the state. But when the Republic fell into its final brutal civil war, beginning after the assassination of Julius Caesar, all of these things now suddenly became subject to negotiation. The rights of citizens to be free from prescription, from death without trial, from the seizure of property, those were suspended. The obligations that those citizens had to the state were supplanted by obligations that those citizens had to individual commanders. And above all, it wasn't clear what participation actually meant anymore. The victor in those civil wars, Octavian, was faced with a major fundamental challenge. How could he redesign the Roman state so that those basic ideas of Rome as a corporation belonging to, a political corporation belonging to its citizens, could be rebuilt in some fashion that also maintained security and stability in the state? And the conflict that began after the assassination of Julius Caesar created a real problem because what Julius Caesar had done to try to solve this question was create a structure where a powerful individual sufficiently dominated the legitimate use of force in Rome that people didn't dare oppose him. And so Caesar's plan was to bring about stability by being that dominant person and in time kind of restructure the republic under him. Now, the problem was, of course, Caesar's assassination didn't involve the replacement of one really powerful man with another who could perform that same function of securing the structures of the state. Instead, it replaced one powerful man with anarchy and civil war. And when that conflict, that civil war, ended with Octavian's victory at Actium in 31 BC and the conquest of Egypt in 30 BC, Rome had changed fundamentally, because the 14 years between Caesar's murder and the final defeat of Antony and Cleopatra had shredded the Roman state's ability to guarantee the lives and property of Roman citizens. It had shredded any trust that people would have that the structures of the state could return to an entity that would again perform the functions Romans expected of it. As you know, many thousands had been proscribed simply for opposing Octavian politically. Tens of thousands had died either fighting for or against him in the civil wars, and entire towns had been displaced so that Octavian could reward his veterans. And so Romans in 30 BC may still have liked the aesthetics of a free representative democracy, but none of them believed that the kind of citizen-held political entity that Rome had had for the previous century worked anymore. No one believed that it still had the power to protect the rights and property of individuals. And so they were ready to accept, or in some cases even embrace, the idea of one man being responsible for providing these basic rights to Roman citizens. But this did not mean that Octavian's job was easy. People may have wanted him to come in and stabilize things after nearly 15 years of civil war, but there was a lot of things Octavian needed to do to address them. He needed to address the immediate trauma of the Civil War. He needed to address the insecurity and the difficulties that these things had caused. But he also needed to address the long-term problems that had brought Rome to the point of civil war. And one of the biggest such problems consisted of breaking the economic relationships that bound Roman soldiers to their individual commanders. Roman soldiers served eagerly for men like Marius and Sulla because they expected bonuses and lands from those commanders when they returned from service. Sulla used this economic dependence of his troops to convince them to march on Rome and overturn the lawful decisions of the government. After Sulla had done this, Pompey shows a kind of new level of sophistication. Pompey too had lots of troops that were loyal to him, but Pompey raised those armies on his own with his own resources. These were not state armies, they were private armies serving under Pompey in the service of the state. But Pompey not only counted upon the support of large numbers of soldiers who were loyal primarily to him, but as he campaigned around the Mediterranean, he also found a way to draw upon the support of those non-Romans living in provinces who he had pardoned while he was campaigning there. And so Pompey built a Mediterranean-wide network of soldiers loyal to him and clients who would also come to his aid should the situation require it. And this sort of network peaked in the 60s. When Pompey returned to Rome in 62, he had this unprecedented level of support and could have used it to take control of the state, but he hesitated to do this. And over the next 15 years, Pompey's position gradually eroded. And so the person who eventually did use a network of loyal soldiers, popular support among common people, great wealth seized from campaigning abroad, and the support of people living abroad, this person who used these resources to take control of the Roman state was Julius Caesar. But Caesar, too, failed to develop a plan to use his immense personal resources to actually run the state in a way that reintegrated all of those structures in a sort of meaningful and sustainable way. Instead, what Caesar believed is the support he had across the Mediterranean, the resources that he had as a wealthy individual and a charismatic politician, and the loyalty he had of his soldiers would potentially allow him to dominate the state to such a degree that he could pardon his senatorial opponents, reintegrate them into the state, and remake Rome so that the same personnel handled the day-to-day workings of the Roman state, whether they opposed Caesar or not. And as you know, this did not prove to be a workable solution. Caesar ended up killed by some of the very same people that he had hoped to bring back into the fold. And so after the Battle of Actium and the conquest of Egypt in 30 BC, Octavian now faced the same task. Now, Octavian would soon get the name that you see here, and the name that is the most famous of the three names he went by in public. This is Augustus. Now, with Egypt under his control, Octavian, soon to be Augustus, personally controlled more resources than any Roman ever. He had masses of troops at his disposal and significant popularity, but the size of his resources shouldn't obscure the difficulty of the task that he faced, because the past century had shown that any individual who controlled too much in the Roman world produced political conflict. And so what Augustus needed to do was to find a way to make his substantial resources instead work to enhance the unity of the Roman state. And this was a slow process. It was one that was full of continual adjustments, but it's one that Augustus accomplished. And it's a really significant accomplishment for Augustus to have done this. Because following Actium, the Republic is dead, at least in terms of it functioning as a system to determine how the Roman state will be run. And it seems that the Roman population, from senators to common people, are willing to accept this, but they wanted the Republican offices to remain very much alive. There was a real sentiment that the regular offices of the Roman state should continue because those offices were a way of conferring honor and recognition to elites whose family members had held these offices for centuries. And so elites wanted the honor and the attention that these offices brought, even if they had little authority to actually make decisions. That was the deal, in essence, they were willing to cut. And their idea for this and their attachment to these offices grew out of something that was called the cursus honorum, which is literally the sequence of offices a member of a Roman elite family was expected to hold. And it was an honor to yourself and your family if you attained the same offices as your ancestors. And this is especially true of the consulship. And so the first step that Augustus took in consolidating power is to hold the consulship every year from 31 to 23 BC. But this is only a part of it, because the process of making his own powers complete while still enabling those other offices to function was slow. The first step in 28 BC was Augustus returning the powers that he held as a triumvir. Then on January 13th of 27 BC, he makes a speech before the Senate in which he lays down all of his powers. He returns all of them to the Senate. And this is met with a barrage of protests from the Senate. Some of them probably genuine because of fear that if he actually did step away, like say Sulla had done, this would bring about anarchy. And so the Senate demands that he takes his powers back, or he takes some powers back. And so a compromise is reached in 27, where Octavian is given military command, imperium, over all of the provinces that contain armies, and he'll appoint the governors of those provinces. He keeps control of these armies. He also gets to continue administering Egypt as basically a personal possession. So he is, in effect, the new pharaoh of Egypt. And Egypt works as a property of the Roman state, but the resources are actually the personal resources of Augustus. The other provinces that didn't contain armies, and so these are parts of Spain, Greece, the province of Asia in Western Turkey, the province of Africa, which is basically the area that's now modern Tunisia. These will be governed by the Senate, and senators will be sent to oversee them. And so what Augustus has basically done, and when this settlement is approved, Augustus is officially given the title Augustus, literally meaning kind of sacrosanct or holy one. Now, the solution is a good one because what it does is it makes sure that Augustus retains control of all of the armies in the Roman state. But it also gives back to the Senate responsibility for administering the provinces that don't have armies in them. And so what this means is the Senate and senators now have the opportunity to go to these provinces, exercise governorships, work in the way that their ancestors had traditionally worked. They get honors, they get rewards. They also get responsibility if things go wrong. Now, after the settlement of 27, Augustus still, however, keeps having himself elected consul each year. And he thought that in doing this, he'd restored the Republic. But senators begin to not think so. And so in 23 BC, after 8 years of peace and Augustus's 8 straight consulships, a conspiracy to kill him is undertaken. And leading it was a group of senators and the other consul for the year 23. Now, this coup is suppressed by Augustus, but he begins to rethink the way his power had been defined. In essence, agreeing to allow Augustus to have the consulship every single year seemed like a good idea in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. But 8 years following the Battle of Actium, it's clear that people in Rome have begun to forget what it was like in the anarchy of the civil wars. They've begun to get used to the peace and calm that a Rome dominated by Augustus is creating. And they begin thinking that, wouldn't it be nice actually if there are 2 consulships available? Not so much because they want to change the direction of the Roman state, but because the honor of a consulship was something that they very, very much wanted to continue sharing in. And so after Augustus puts down the coup in 23 BC, he arranges for another settlement with the Senate. He resigns the consulship, and in place of the consulship, the Senate works out a law, and the tribunes work out a law that is enacted to give Augustus imperium over all provinces for a 10-year period. He's also given the powers of a tribune of the plebs, including sacrosanctity. Now, this is really important because the power of a tribune of the plebs gives him the ability to veto any law. It gives him the ability to propose any law. It also means that he's now taking up the position of an office that belongs to the people, not an office that belongs to the elite. He's in essence trading a very scarce resource that he has monopolized, the consulship, for an office that is not at all scarce. The tribunate is something where he doesn't even hold that position, but that position is not a significant part of the cursus honorum either. And so there aren't senatorial families that are angling to get a position as tribune of the plebs, and even so, there are 10 of them. And so it's not like Augustus is now taking rewards and taking honors away from senators. Augustus now has, in effect, made and become aware and made an acknowledgement of the resource of the consulship as something that senators want, just simply so that they can say they had it. And so basically he's traded the aristocratic office for the consul for the popular office of the tribune. But then he does something very interesting. The settlement in 23 addresses the problem that seems to have caused the coup attempt. But it also addresses the underlying sense that Rome is now stable and it can begin challenging Augustus's structure. Because after the settlement in 23, Augustus leaves Rome, and he's gone for the better part of 3 years. He goes to Asia Minor, he goes to Parthia, he goes to negotiate with the Parthians, he goes to Spain. And while he's away, chaos breaks out in Rome again. There are food riots, so that in 22 BC, while Rome is up in arms because insufficient food has been provided by the municipal government, Augustus agrees to pay money out of his own pocket to alleviate the crisis and buy food for the common people. This is very deliberate. Augustus's pockets, Augustus's personal resources, of course, include Egypt. All of Egypt, all of the resources of Egypt, as well as lots of other resources that he's begun accumulating across the empire. What Augustus is very careful to do is to be sure that there are 2 budgets in Rome. There is, in effect, the public budget that governs the activities of the public state and the activities that, for example, the Senate and senators administer. Then there's the private budget. That is the budget that belongs to Augustus, and it is very, very substantial. But what Augustus ensures is that the public budget is either at or near deficit at all times. There's little give in the public budget to deal with emergencies. If there is an emergency, Augustus wants to be sure that Romans know he is the one fixing that problem. And so in 22 BC, when there is this food shortage, Augustus makes it known that it's his money that is being used to fix the problem. Then in 19 BC, Ignatius Rufus, a popular figure who had organized the public fire brigade, tries to run for consul illegally. The Senate declares a state of emergency, and it asks Augustus to return to restore order. And he does. In October of 19, Augustus returns. And he returns following the Senate asking him to come back and the people pleading for him to come back. His point is now made. What Augustus can say clearly following his 3-year absence is the Roman state can't function without him there. It cannot provide the resources necessary for people to survive. It cannot provide the security that Romans expect in a political system. It cannot give that basic guarantee that Roman citizens' lives, property, and rights will be respected. And so Augustus has to come back. And he's made the point that anyone who thought the Republic might be a good idea now can remember what the Republic was actually like: a time of shortage, a time of chaos, a time of insufficient resources, a time that Augustus has ended, and that his resources now will prevent from coming back. It seems likely that if Augustus didn't manufacture these crises, he was at least expecting that crises like these would come up. And he also knew that these crises would enable him to make the point to people that he was the one who secured the basic promises that Rome made to its citizens. And so following his return in 19, Augustus's powers are again redefined. The Senate gives him additional powers that equate to those of a consul, though he doesn't need to hold the office. There are still 2 consuls, but Augustus always enjoyed the privilege of sitting between them. And this made him essentially a permanent unelected 3rd consul. Now, this document is a really fascinating text. It's a text called the Res Gestae Divi Augusti. And this is basically the deeds of the divine Augustus. It's something that Augustus wrote, and it was posted throughout the Mediterranean at temples that were dedicated to the memory of Augustus himself. This is a modern reconstruction of the text. It's on the wall of what's now the Areopagus Museum in the city of Rome. But this gives you a sense of what this did once look like. And in the Res Gestae, Augustus described what actually the transfer of power meant in the kind of spin that Augustus put on it. Augustus says, "I transferred the Republic from my own power to the dominion of the Senate and the people of Rome. And after this time, I excelled everybody in influence, auctoritas, although I possess no more official power than others who are my colleagues in several magistracies." Now, the concept of auctoritas here is quite interesting. What it means is Augustus is more influential, even though the powers that he possesses are no greater than those of his colleagues in several magistracies. Now, on one level, this is absolutely true. Augustus had no more powers than his colleagues in many magistracies. But unlike those colleagues in the magistracies, he had the powers of multiple magistracies at once. So what Augustus is basically saying here is the Republic continues to exist, but I sit above it with more influence, but the Republic still functions as it should. It's given back to the people, it's given back to the Senate, it works as it did before, and I just stand there as one who guarantees its authority, but I don't do it in any way that transcends the normal bounds of powers that are attached to people holding offices. This is the official story. The reality, of course, is excelling all in influence means he really does dominate the state, but not in a way that eliminates the technical powers that other people have, that consuls have or that praetors have. The coin on the right is a good example of how we can visualize this. This is a coin where the front of the coin, the obverse of the coin, has an image of Augustus. And if you read it, it says Caesar, Augustus, Pontifex Maximus. This is Augustus excelling all in authority. And that's interesting. It's a living person on the front of a Roman coin. Until Julius Caesar, this was something that was generally frowned upon. So the front of the coin advertises this excelling and exceeding all in influence. The reverse of the coin, though, shows something very different. If you look at this, what you see is triumvir, AAA, and then the names of some of these individuals. These are the moneyers who made and issued coins in the Roman Republic. And the SC refers to a senatorial sanction for the issue of this coin. So the front of the coin, in a sense, shows Augustus as the one who exceeds all in influence. The back of the coin advertises continuity with the Republic. This is, I think, a very interesting way to imagine what Augustus has done. The veneer of the Republic and the low-level functions of the Republic remain in place. And this is a very good situation for Augustus because it means that all of the day-to-day stuff, minting coins, fixing potholes, dealing with food supply, dealing with floods, when those things work well, he can entrust them to the people who had always done these things under the Republic. You want to issue coins? You entrust the minting of bronze coins to the moneyers who had done this for centuries. But everybody knows as well, if something goes wrong, you are the one who will fix it. And so what Augustus has is plausible deniability when something goes wrong, but he gets to play the hero and fix things when those problems actually occur. And so the constitutional structure is something that Augustus, I think, has very precisely defined. The Republic still exists, but it exists below the supervision of this individual who excels and exceeds all in influence. Now, one of the most important things that Augustus did to try to make this sustainable was to purge the Roman system of all of those things that had once linked land to military and political power. And once he was secure in power, Augustus began to work to purge such things from the Roman system. So one of the most notorious things that Augustus did while he was Octavian, the triumvir, was to seize the lands of lots of people in Italy so that he could give property to his soldiers. He says in the Res Gestae, after the campaigns were done and the wars were over, I reimbursed municipalities for the lands which I assigned to my soldiers in my fourth consulship. The sums involved were about 600 million sesterces, which I paid for Italian estates, and about 260 million sesterces that I paid for provincial lands. I was the first and only one to take such action of all those who up to my time established colonies of soldiers. So what Augustus has done here is basically tried to right the wrongs of what he did when he was still Octavian. The confiscation of lands and the very, very blatant violation of the guarantee that the Roman state gave to its citizens that they would be protected in their lives and properties, Augustus knew that was a problem. And so Augustus made recompense to the Roman citizens who had lost their land in this unjustified way. It doesn't fix the abuse entirely. The abuse still occurred, but it does compensate the people who are victimized by it. It is, in a sense, rebuilding that social contract, rebuilding that basic structure that says that Romans have an expectation of due process and they have an expectation to live under the law. Augustus is here kind of trying to rebuild that sense. The other thing that's really significant about this is the sum. 860 million sesterces is about 4.5 times the fortune that Crassus possessed. Actually, more than that. This is more money than any individual Roman ever had by like an order of magnitude. And Augustus transferred this out of his own money. But this isn't the only thing that Augustus does out of his own money. To prevent future large confiscations of land with the excuse that these should go to veterans, Augustus created a veterans fund, a pension fund for soldiers. And so Augustus says, I transferred out of my own money 170 million sesterces to the soldiers' bonus fund, which was established on my advice for the purpose of providing bonuses for soldiers who'd completed 20 or more years of service. This is discharged veterans. This occurred in AD 6, so 6 AD. And the significance of this gesture is that Augustus now has created a new era in the way Romans interact with their veterans. Because the state is again providing benefits to soldiers, but it's not the state as the state. It's the emperor. And the emperor has made clear that the money supporting these soldiers' retirement comes not out of the public funds that he controls. It comes out of the private funds, his own money. The other thing is these benefits are monetary. They aren't land, which is a finite quantity and which has to be taken from somebody. This is money. And so Augustus has created a pension fund that gives soldiers money. And those soldiers remain loyal to him because it's his money that he's given. It's not public money, it's private money. And so the relationship between land, power, and politics has shifted. For the previous century, since Marius's reform, land, power, and politics had been joined in this way that subverted the functioning of the Roman state. Individual commanders were responsible for ensuring the rewards of their soldiers, but they also served as agents of the state. And when someone like Sulla decided to leverage the needs of individual soldiers against the best interests of the state, soldiers had to choose whether they were going to remain loyal to the state or loyal to their commander. What Augustus has created is a situation where Augustus is the state. Soldiers who are loyal to Augustus get the rewards that soldiers loyal to a commander get. But they also are loyal to the state. And so this breakdown where soldiers loyal to a commander might fight against the interests of the state because their own personal interests are more secured, this has ended. Because the emperor is the one who secures their personal interests. And the emperor is the person who manages the security of the state. Another sort of shift was connected to Augustus's bringing into the administrative structure of Rome a lot of new people from families that had not previously seen this level of authority. And a lot of these people came from the new citizen bodies that had been incorporated under the social war. And so what Augustus was able to do was expand the group of Roman aristocrats who participated in governing the empire in such a way that it recognized the resources of people who had previously been excluded, people from around Italy. And some of Augustus's friends became fabulously wealthy as a result of their cooperation with Augustus. So, for example, this monument is a funeral monument to a man named, made by a man named Cestius. It was completed in 12 BC, and the pyramid design was, of course, a partial homage to Augustus's conquest of Egypt. Earlier, in around 30 BC, we have this wonderful funerary monument. The pyramid is actually very close. If you go to Rome, it's very close to the metro station Pyramide, which has an obvious connection to this. The tomb of Eurysachus is very close to Termini station. And Eurysachus is the official baker of Octavian's army. And so Eurysachus put up this funerary monument in the shape of a large baking oven with scenes of people making bread. This is a way for Eurysachus, and there's the inscription on top of it, and there's another image of it. This is a way for Eurysachus to advertise his contribution to the regime. Now, Augustus himself was no architectural slouch. And he understood quite clearly how to use buildings to emphasize aspects of how he wanted his regime perceived. So Augustus built a huge tomb near the Tiber River. This is it now. But it's part of a large complex that includes a mausoleum, an obelisk taken from Egypt, and a monument on the far side of this called the Areopagus, or the Altar of Peace. And this is a monumental program that Augustus designed to emphasize his achievements as emperor. So the obelisk symbolizes the conquest of Egypt. The Areopagus is an altar of peace that symbolizes the peace that Augustus brought back to the regime. And of course, the mausoleum completes this by emphasizing Augustus's own personal place in achieving these things, these two great achievements that help define how he wants the public to understand him. This is the Mausoleum of Augustus. It has recently actually been reopened, so it's no longer overgrown in quite this way. Now, the Areopagus is a really significant part of this program, more so even than the obelisk. So the altar of peace, this is how Augustus describes it in the Res Gestae. He says, when I returned to Rome from Spain and Gaul, having successfully accomplished matters in those provinces, when Tiberius Nero and Publius Quintilius were consuls in 13 BC, the Senate voted to consecrate the altar of Augustan peace in the field of Mars for my return, on which it ordered the magistrates and priests and Vestal virgins to offer annual sacrifices. That's the reconstructed altar of peace on the right. Now, Augustus goes on to say, our ancestors wanted the Temple of Janus to be closed when throughout all of the rule of the Roman people by land and sea, peace had been secured through victory. Although before my birth it had been closed twice in all of recorded history since the founding of the city, the Senate voted 3 times in my principate that it be closed. On the right, you see a coin that shows the Temple of Janus with those doors closed. Now, the Areopagus was designed to emphasize the peace that Augustus brought. What you see here is what has been reconstructed in the Areopagus Museum, with the altar actually inside this sculptural setting. And the Areopagus is designed to emphasize the peace and prosperity that Augustus brought back to the Roman world. One of the key parts of this, though, is on the side of the Areopagus is a procession showing the kind of sacrifices and the rituals that the Senate decreed should be held at this. And in this, what you see are the imperial family. The imperial family moving and sacrificing, moving in procession and sacrificing. So in this we see, for example, Augustus's wife Julia, his best friend and general Agrippa, the grandson Gaius Caesar, Tiberius, his future successor, and then there's the image on the side. Now the Areopagus and the processions led by Augustus show that this was a public event. The Areopagus was a public monument, but it was one that was supposed to celebrate the participation of everybody in Roman society in celebrating the peace that Augustus had brought about. And this is key because this is the basic promise that Augustus is renewing for Romans. The idea that the Republic can protect them, it can protect their lives, it can protect their property. And the altar of Augustan peace is a way to ensure that those properties and rights are protected in the way that Romans hoped and expected. Now, Augustus also became a patron of the arts. This is kind of propaganda, but it's not direct propaganda. Instead, what Augustus did is he provided resources to poets like Horace and Virgil to use their talents to talk about Rome in general, and when it sees them, to talk about the great things that Augustus had brought about. But it wasn't just poets. The architect Vitruvius wrote a book on architecture that he dedicated to Augustus. And for the most part, these artists are patronized because of their merits as artists. They were sometimes friendly to the regime, but they weren't always friendly to the regime. They were patronized because they were good and they were producing good art. And in the moment where they were producing it, it was useful to Augustus to have this art patronized. People who were not favorable towards the regime, or people who caused problems for the regime, could be treated badly. So the poet Ovid, for example, was exiled to Romania because of problems that he was causing in the court, and particularly because of a scandal involving the daughter of Augustus. But nevertheless, what we can say is Augustus can be said to have produced a real flowering of literary culture. Besides the artistic concern, though, The regime of Augustus was also notable for trying to reverse the perception of a decline in Roman life by targeting what Augustus would categorize as immoral behavior. So, to many, the late Republic was seen as a time of out-of-control vice, and the political problems of the Republic were seen to have been caused by Romans behaving viciously. And so lots of greed, lots of devotion to pleasure, lots of things like adultery occurring because of Romans' general breakdown in the respect they had for traditional ways of behaving. This was seen as a corruption of the times, but it was also seen in some ways as a representation of the causes of the political problems of the later Republic. Authors like Sallust said this explicitly, that the political decline of Rome was tied to a moral decline in Roman behavior. And so Augustus worked to change some of this. He did nothing about greed. These guys back here are, of course, people who profited extensively from Augustus, and Augustus had no problem with these guys being greedy and profiting. But what Augustus was really concerned with was moral behaviors that could be regulated, particularly sexual behaviors. So one thing that Augustus was particularly upset about was adultery. And so Augustus passed a series of laws that made adultery a crime that could be prosecuted. And what's ironic about this is Augustus's daughter and his granddaughter are both exiled because of adultery, but Augustus himself was a famous adulterer who wasn't punished for this at all. The most ironic of these laws, though, is something that occurs near the end of Augustus's life, the Lex Papia Poppaea. This is a law of 9 AD that penalizes childless and unmarried people. And it also basically holds as an expectation that people should have 3 children and be married. The law was named after the consuls who presided when the law was passed. And the interesting thing about it is neither of these consuls actually were in compliance with the law that they passed. But Augustus wasn't either. Augustus himself only had 1 child, and his wife Livia only had 2, both from a previous marriage, and the consuls themselves were bachelors. And so as you can imagine, this law was more about being suggestive of fixing problems in the Roman state than actually fixing problems in the Roman state. But this perception of things in Rome being fixed, or the perception that things in Rome were now better, extended even to things like religious life. So one of the things that Augustus was particularly happy about was his claim that he rebuilt temples. So in the Res Gestae, we're told that he rebuilt the Capitol and Holy Temples, numbering 82. He rebuilt the Theater of Pompey, waterways, and the Flaminian Road. Augustus was very interested in building new things, but he was also interested in fixing things, in making it clear to everybody in Rome that he was correcting problems that he had inherited. And so temples being decrepit offered Augustus an opportunity to intervene in a meaningful way to fix those things that he could blame as problems that had arisen from the decadence of the Republic. And one of the most significant repairs, in a sense, that Augustus brought about was a repair to Roman prestige. When we talked about the fall of the Republic, and we talked particularly about the breakdown of the first triumvirate that joined Pompey and Crassus and Caesar, the event that catalyzed that more than any other was Crassus's defeat by the Parthians in what's now kind of eastern Syria. When Crassus was defeated, the defeat was so complete and so total that the Parthians actually captured a number of standards from the army. And this was seen as a tremendous humiliation by the Romans. So what Augustus proposed to do was to negotiate the return of the standards that Crassus had lost. And so on this statue of Augustus, the famous Prima Porta statue of Augustus, the centerpiece of his breastplate is a Parthian representative giving back to Augustus the standards lost by Crassus. And so Augustus considered it a great triumph to have brought these standards back. And he did it in a way that was peaceful. And this actually was something that both the Parthians and the Romans wanted. Augustus didn't really want to go to war with Parthia. He had no real interest in that kind of a campaign. He was instead interested in rationalizing the Roman frontiers, and a war with Parthia wouldn't do that. The Parthians also didn't particularly want to fight the Romans. And so Augustus negotiated the return of the standards and then celebrated this return as something that underlined his commitment to peace in the Roman world. This was a great triumph for Augustus on a number of levels. It undid the humiliation of Crassus's defeat, but it undid it in a fashion that also emphasized aspects of what Augustus wanted Romans to remember about his own regime. Augustus also had another set of foreign policy successes that are really important to recognize. In the Republic, Roman conquests had generally been kind of ad hoc affairs that related mainly to the amount of wealth and booty that could be seized from a particular campaign. And so when Augustus took over the Roman state, the Roman frontiers didn't make a lot of sense. They were defined not by what was strategically defensible, but simply by where commanders had decided to stop, either because their command had expired, or because somebody had made peace, or simply because the next part that they could potentially conquer wasn't profitable enough for anyone to worry about it. What Augustus decided to do was to establish defensible and reasonable frontiers for Rome, and to campaign so that the Roman state eventually extended to include those. Particularly in Europe, the decision that Augustus made to establish the Rhine and the Danube as the Roman frontiers was something that would have very long-standing implications. Once Augustus decided that the Rhine would be the frontier, it remained the frontier without real exceptions, aside from one attempt in the 3rd century to try to expand into Germany. The Danube frontier was respected for the better part of 100 years, until the Emperor Trajan decided to conquer what's now most of modern Romania. But what's important to understand about this is Augustus made these decisions not because there was a huge amount of plunder to be gained by attacking people in what's now Austria or Serbia. There wasn't. These were not wealthy areas. Instead, they were strategically significant areas. And the Republic was unwilling and unable to engage in the kind of strategic thinking that was required to establish these defensible frontiers. But Augustus was signed up for the job of running the Roman state for life. And so he had to think, and he had the advantage of being able to think strategically about the long-term interests of the Roman state, and his campaigns were centered on advancing those long-term strategic interests. But besides transforming the frontiers, Augustus also made an effort to transform the military into something that was more sustainable. One of the things that Augustus had learned from the civil wars in the late Republic was that professional troops were far and away better than the citizen levies that had for a long time typified the armies that Romans brought into the field. Professional soldiers like the ones that Caesar brought into Gaul really showed their superior fighting ability in the Civil War. So to give an example, the Battle of Mutina, we can see the difference between raw recruits, somewhat veteran soldiers, and the hardcore professional armies of Caesar. When Antony is besieging Mutina, he has veteran soldiers. When Hirtius and Pansa, the 2 consuls, show up and begin fighting Antony, they have raw recruits. And Antony's veteran soldiers, despite the fact that they have basically the same equipment, cut to pieces the raw recruits. But when Augustus, who was then Octavian, shows up with an army trained and who had fought under Caesar, they do to Antony's veterans what Antony's veterans had done to the raw recruits. And so Augustus understands that a smaller but better army is a better long-term investment for the Romans. And by the late Republic and by the time of the Civil Wars, the Roman army had 70 legions in the field, which was over 1 million troops if you include all of the auxiliaries and support people. But these were not all 1 million troops who were really good fighters. There was at the core a group of people like those soldiers who had served under Caesar who were really good soldiers. But 1 million troops is a large number of people to arm, pay, and provide with pension benefits. And so what Augustus realized is he needed to cut the number of legions down and keep them at a constant level so that their needs could be provided for in a reasonable and expected way, and you could budget for their retirement in a reasonable and expected way. And so when the civil wars were over, he reduced the number of legions from 70 down to 28. Their field strength was 5,000. They were supplemented by another 5,000 auxiliaries, and so the total army was around 300,000 men. But they were good. They were professional soldiers. They were the same sorts of veterans with lots of combat experience that had shown their mettle in the civil wars. And so 300,000 men with that kind of background were far better than 1 million men made up of raw recruits. Augustus also divided the army so that it was under many different commanders. He made sure the soldiers understood that they were being compensated by Augustus himself. He also made sure that no individual commander had more than 4 legions, and no region ever had more than 4 legions. The idea there was of those 28, any commander who decided to rebel would be guaranteed to be facing off against soldiers who understood that their pension benefits were coming from the emperor and understood that the emperor still had 24 legions that were loyal to it. Also, he made sure that no 2 legions were ever allowed to be in the same camp. And so what Augustus was doing was making sure on one level, on the sort of big level, soldiers understood that the emperor was responsible for their long-term financial success. He also built in all kinds of circuit breakers, in a sense, to prevent any commander from developing enough of a following that he might decide to challenge the emperor. And so these were stability mechanisms as well. The Roman army that was there was a powerful army, but it was divided in such a way that it remained unlikely to rebel against the emperor. And then later in his regime, he comes up with a way to pay for this sustainably so that the retirement and the funding of the armies was not something that would be dependent solely on the amount of money that the emperor himself could provide. So he instituted a 5% tax on inheritance and a 1% tax on sales at auction. And these were financial transactions that the state could very effectively monitor because inheritance depended on wills. And so the will had to be regulated and registered with state authorities. So Roman authorities could very easily take that 5% tax out of an estate. And sales at auction could also be very easily monitored. Those only took place at certain moments and certain occasions. And so the tax could again be very easily assessed and collected. And the money from these things was designated to go to pay for veterans. And the effect of this was subtle but very real because the soldiers were again loyal to the state, not their commanders. Because it was the state, and specifically the emperor, who would pay their wages and make sure that they were taken care of following their discharge. And so this ended the Republican problem of loyalty to a commander and instead replaced it with loyalty to a state headed by an emperor. And so as you can see, Augustus had managed to tame many of the beasts that had plagued the later Republic. But he was mortal, and his solution depended upon his person remaining at the center of the state. And so to ensure that the system survived for another generation, Augustus understood that he needed to be completely clear about who would succeed him. And he worked really hard to do this. He was really troubled by the question of succession because he was a frail man. He, as a young man, got sick frequently. At moments, people thought he wouldn't survive. And so he always tried to be sure to make arrangements to make it clear to Romans who would follow him if he died. His first choice was Marcus Agrippa, the admiral who had won the Battle of Actium for Augustus. But Agrippa, who was a very robust man and was actually married to Augustus's daughter, died before Augustus, which I think was very surprising to Augustus. He died in 12 BC. And so Augustus then turned his attention to his nephews, Lucius and Gaius. Both of them were groomed by Augustus to take power. They were given increasingly important offices, and Augustus made it clear that he wanted them to succeed him. But unfortunately, they also both died young, and the choice fell ultimately to Augustus' stepson, Tiberius. Now, Tiberius we'll talk about in the next lecture, but Tiberius was treated very badly by Augustus. And early in his life, he was a very successful general. But when Lucius and Gaius became Augustus's clear successors, Tiberius retired from public life. He left Rome and moved to the island of Rhodes, but eventually he became the only one of Augustus's inner circle who was still alive. And so Augustus had to bring him back and appoint him as successor. And we can see next time how Tiberius, despite being actually really quite competent and capable, really struggled to figure out how to articulate the position of an emperor who hadn't seized power in the way that Augustus had. Now, the last thing that I think is really interesting to think about is the way that Augustus described all of this. Because Augustus lived for a very long time. He entered public life as a 19-year-old, and he lived until he was 76. And so he lived as a public figure in Rome as long as most Romans lived, period. There were, when he died, very, very few people who remembered any kind of system previous to the one that Augustus has actually worked on. And a person with that long life in public affairs is a person who becomes very interested in trying to shape the way that they are perceived. And Augustus's res gestae is a significant part of the way that Augustus shaped that public memory of his achievements. The res gestae was inscribed on tablets to be displayed at temples to the divine Augustus that were erected around the empire. An original copy of it was set on 2 bronze columns in Rome, and the example we have comes from Ankara in Turkey. The document itself is written by Augustus, and it's designed to outline his accomplishments, and it presents his rise to power in a very informative way. The first part of this is that he avenged the death of his father. The second part of it is he is a member of the triumvirate with Antony and Lepidus. The third part of it is he saves the republic from the tyranny of Antony. And then he talks about giving power back to the Roman state. And so he says, in my 6th and 7th consulships, after putting out the civil war, having obtained all things by universal consent, I handed over the state from my power to the dominion and the Senate of the Roman people. He then describes how his powers were consistent with the custom of the past. So although the Senate and the people consented that I alone be made curator of laws and customs with the highest power, I received no magistracy offered contrary to the customs of my ancestors. What the Senate then wanted to accomplish through me, I did through tribunician power. And 5 times on my own accord, I both requested and received from the Senate a colleague in such power. Augustus then is taking a very clear rhetorical position that describes why what he's doing represents an effective evolution of the Republican constitutional order that was no longer functional. And he suggests that this was something that was necessary. The empire, in a sense, is a continuity of the Republic, but it's also something that represents a more stable evolution of the Roman state. And Augustus wants every Roman to understand he's not breaking with the basic principles that made Rome what it was, that made the Roman political system what it was. He's offering peace, he's offering security, but he's not offering a political structure in which the rights and property of individuals will be trampled upon by one dominant figure who doesn't respect or understand what Romans get as citizens of this state. What Augustus is trying to offer is a guarantee of continuity with the Roman past, with the Republican Roman past, while also promising positive changes that make the state more functional and make people's place in it more secure. This is the foundation of what the empire will be. And Augustus's way of framing this is ingenious. It's something that works because he has gradually adapted the structure of the Roman state in a way that functionally is very different from how the Republic ever functioned, but in practice and in theory upholds many of the same principles that made Romans think so fondly of the Republic when the Republic did work as intended. And so this is what makes the transition from the Republic to the Empire so enduring and so difficult for people to reverse.